I'm David Brown. I'm the chair of the INTNS History Project. Today, I'm interviewing Professor Kenji Doya. Professor Doya is a professor of the Neural Computation Unit, Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, OIST, Graduate University. He received his Ph.D. in 1991 at the University of Tokyo and worked as a postdoc at UC San Diego and the Selk Institute. In 1994, he joined Advanced Telecommunications Research International, ATR, as a senior researcher, and then served as a group leader of the Kawato Dynamic Brain Project. In 2004, he was appointed as a principal investigator of the OIST Initial Research Project and started the Okinawa Computational Neuroscience Center, OCNC, as chief organizer. As OIST established itself as a graduate university in 2011, he became a professor and served as the Vice Provost for research. He is interested in reinforcement learning in both natural and artificial creatures. He has served as co-editor-in-chief of Neural Networks from 2008 to 2021, and a board member of the International Neural Network Society, the Japanese Neural Network Society, and the Japan Neuroscience Society. He served as the chairman of the Neuro 2022 conference in Okinawa. He received the INTNS Donald O. Hebb Award in 2018, the JNNS Academic Award, the INTNS Outstanding Achievement Award, and the age group second place at the Ironman Taiwan in 2019. Well, Professor Doya, my first question would be, how did you get into running Ironman competitions?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so as you just introduced, I was doing a postdoc in San Diego, where triathlon is quite popular. So at that time, I was like a postdoc, so I didn't have money to buy a sports bike, but I did commute by bike. So yeah, I got interested. And then in the last summer, my office mate, who was Rich Zemel, he's now leading AI Institute in Toronto, gave me a kind of a flyer for the announcement of the local triathlon race, which was relatively short. So we thought maybe it is doable. So we joined the competition, and then we had very good fun. So that's how I get into triathlon. So after coming back to Japan in ATR, so that was in rather suburban area. So new science town, wide road, no cars. So it's an excellent place to train bicycling and also running. And also there were nearby swimming pool. So I started the triathlon, yeah. And actually, so after coming to Okinawa, because Okinawa is a very nice environment, even some professional athletes come to Okinawa for training. So my performance also improved a lot after coming to Okinawa. Yeah.
Well, I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
Of course, I'm also very impressed with all of the work you've done in artificial intelligence. So my first real question then is, how did you get into the field?
Yeah, so in our university, so we can select the field after 2 years in undergraduate. So I was initially thinking of either like architecture or like telecommunications, but yeah, I was thinking of something like internet today. But even if the telecommunication network is well established, so even in a live interaction, people can sometimes do not understand well. So I was interested in the our mind or brain's mechanism for understanding each other. So that was my start of interest in neuroscience. But I was in the Faculty of Engineering, rather than doing a biomedical approach, so I thought there might be any like information scientific approach to the brain. And then I found a keyword like 生体情報工学 bioinformation engineering in one of the department in University of Tokyo, which was a department for mathematical engineering and information physics. So where the legendary people like Professor Jinichi Nagumo and Professor Shunichi Amari were there. So that's how I chose that department and started my study and research. Yeah.
Now, what are your most significant accomplishments, do you believe?
Yeah, so when I started the research, so my supervisor at the time, the Professor Kaoru Nakano, was a very liberal person. He let me do whatever I wanted to do. So, and at that time, the personal computers became available to undergraduate students. So I wanted to do something interesting. So because I was into sports at that time, not a triathlon, but skiing. So I wanted to work on like motor learning. So how people and animals learn to be able to perform different motor skills. So I wanted to build a robot which learned to do something. So I created a very small robot which can learn to walk with a very simple like hill climb algorithm in the walking parameter space. So at that time, I didn't know anything about the reinforcement learning, but I realized this is one kind of reinforcement learning. So that's how I started my career in reinforcement learning. So from the my interest in improving my own motor skills. And then since then, I did several works, for example, training of recurrent neural networks, and also some theory of reinforcement learning in the continuous time, continuous state domain. But I think my major contribution would be the clarifying the mechanism of the part of the brain called basal ganglia in reinforcement learning. So it has been suggested by previous works by Wolfram Schutz and modeling works by Peter Dayan and Reid Montague that dopamine seems to play a very important role in reinforcement learning in the brain. And then the basal ganglia is a major recipient of dopamine projection. So many people were interested in what the dopamine is doing in the basal ganglia. So, and then from the theory of reinforcement learning, we came up with a hypothesis is that maybe the basal ganglia would be involved in associating the state and action with the prediction of reward, which is called the value function. So, and then at the ATL using functional MRI and also in OIST, we started rat and mouse experiments. So, and then experimentally test whether if there's any like a value like representation in the brain. Unfortunately, we could show that there indeed such a reward predictive response in the human basal ganglia by the functional MRI and also in the rat basal ganglia using electrode recording. So yes, I think this is a better understanding of the mechanism of reinforcement learning in the brain. I think that is one of the major contribution that I could make.
Ah,
Yeah, and additionally, so if you have worked on like a neural network training, you know that the parameter tuning is very tricky, right? So then I started to think, what do the mechanism of parameter tuning in our own brain, right? So that led me to the interest of neuromodulators. Dopamine is one of the most famous one, but acetylcholine, noradrenaline, and the serotonin are also very important. But their functions are not so clearly understood. So, and among those neuromodulators, we were most interested in the mechanism of the serotonin, which was one of the most enigmatic neurotransmitters. And then from my experience in reinforcement learning, I came up with a conjecture that the serotonin may be controlling the temporal discounting factor. How long into the future you take into account when you make a decision and when you learn something, right? So sometimes you have to focus on what's happening right now. Sometimes you want to think longer into the future. So maybe serotonin might be involved in such a control. And then fortunately, we could start study of serotonin in humans using like a dietary control, and in animals more directly recording serotonin neuron or manipulating a serotonin neuron activity. So then we could verify that serotonin indeed seems to be involved in how large weight you put to a future delayed reward. I think that is like a second important contributions we could make.
That sounds very very interesting. And I think you probably answered part of what my next question is. What are you working on now, or how do you see yourself doing research in the future?
Yeah, so the mechanism of basic reinforcement learning has been much clearer than maybe 10 years or 15 years ago. But basal ganglia doesn't work alone. So it works in a loop circuit with the thalamus and the cortex. So then how the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia work together for reinforcement learning and decision making. That is the next big topic. And then we generally think that cerebral cortex is involved in like representation learning, different representation of the environmental state and body state, and also action plan, right? So how such like a goal-directed representations are learned in the cortex together with the basal ganglia. And also in some cases, the sensory input is not sufficient. So you have to infer the state of the environment or state of your body. So such something like a hidden state estimation seems to be a part of the function of the cerebral cortex. So then understanding such a mechanism, the cortex in the behavior is the major target. Of course, many people have been working on the cerebral cortex. But one direction I think would be interesting is that so-called duality of inference and control, right? So such a duality was proposed in like 1960s by Kalman. So for the similarity of the Kalman filter and the linear quadratic controller. But more recently, so theoreticians have found that there's a clear like a similarity between the computation for the log posterior distribution in the inference problem and the computation of the value function in the reinforcement learning problem. And there's some transfer, for example, method derived for the Bayesian inference can be applied for reinforcement learning. So I think there's a very exciting theoretical development, but that can also provide some insight to how our brain works. So because the posterior part of our brain mainly work on the sensory processing, inferring the state of the body and the environment. And the frontal part of the brain, the cortex, is mainly involved in movement control or decision planning. So, but the entire cortex share the similar 6-layer organization, right? So then if the sensory processing and the motor control are totally different things, so it's strange that the same architecture can be used. But this duality between the inference and the control might be a clue to understand the common computational framework across the sensory cortex to the motor and the prefrontal cortex. So, I just wrote like a review paper for the current opinions on behavioral science, but I want to push forward whether such idea can really help us understand the architecture of the cerebral cortex in sensory inference and movement control. Yeah, so that's something I want to work on in the coming years.
Well, that sounds extremely interesting.
Yeah.
Changing gears here. What do you recall about the early days of the field, or in the early days of INNS?
Oh, yeah. So actually, so my first international conference was ICNN 2088. So that was early days of like a connectionism, right? Yeah. So it was very impressive. So and also I liked the San Diego. So that's why I chose my postdoc in San Diego. So fortunately, through the I could find that I realized that some people in the UC San Diego who are working on the neural oscillators who are interested in my work on the recurrent network learning. So I had a chance to be a postdoc at the Professor Alan Silverstone in biology department. Yeah, so one interesting thing in San Diego was that there's a very close interaction between neurobiologists and the theoreticians. Right? So there are theorists like David Zipser and also Terry Senosky and many other people. So, and then this was a kind of a beginning of what we now call computational neuroscience. Right? So in old days, brain theorists just read the paper of the biologists and then came up with abstract theory. But the field were changing. So the neurobiologists and the theoreticians work closer in the lab and then look at the raw data and then try to come up with a more realistic model. And then the hypothesis can be tested experimentally. So that kind of a study was starting in UCSD and Selk, and I could witness that change. So that was a very critical experience for me. So, and also there are many young researchers like me, so who are interested in both brain and computation were in San Diego. So, and people I knew as a young researcher are now spread around the world and have their own laboratories. So such a network of people, that is also a very important asset to me. Yeah. So yeah, for the starting up of my research, the INNS played a very important role. Let me meet with important people, and also I could publish some of my early papers in the Neural Networks journal. Yeah. Yeah.
You've played a very prominent role,
Mm.
obviously, with the journal,
Mm.
and also on the board of INNS. What role should INNS play moving ahead into the future?
Mm. Yeah, so now many people are interested in deep learning. Yeah, but I think an interesting point of INNS and also JNNS in Japan is that it's a kind of a mixture of people who are interested in producing a better algorithm and understanding the brain function and seeking some kind of common theory behind them. Right? So such like a interaction between the people interested in the brain and the people interested in computation, I think INNS and JNNS and APNNS and the other society would play an important role in bringing people together, like a common platform where the people from a different background can discuss and teach each other. So I think that is a very important role INNS can play. Yeah.
Now, I would like you to be quite candid and take a look at the overall field of AI. What are people doing right, or what are they doing wrong in AI?
Yeah, so it's hard to tell, but the important change these days is with the popularity of deep learning and also the tools for the deep learning. Now the entry into the field became much easier than before. So some time ago, to be a good machine learning researcher, you have to go through all the rigorous mathematics. But in deep learning, you can create a network relatively easily. So I think wider people came into the field with deep learning. So there's a good things and bad things. Good things that the people can try many different things. So new proposals, for example, like a variation autoencoder or GAN, generative adversarial network, or the most recently transformer. So variety of architecture were proposed. So and that actually made a large contribution. But some people may argue that such like ad hoc network building is not well disciplined. And then, but successful architecture would have something, some reason. So that will set a new target for theoreticians to understand it, right? So yeah, so many people coming in, trying different things. And also, if we combine that with the good theoretical work, the field will further progress. Yeah. So there's some concerns about the network becoming too big and too complex, but I'm optimistic that we can eventually find out why such a complex network works, and then we can maybe make a networks in a better disciplined way. Yeah.
Well, what advice would you give for a researcher just starting out in the field?
Yeah, so I just followed my interest and curiosity. So if you find something interesting or intriguing, go deep into it, right? So rather than just following something new in the field, so pursuing your own question, I think that is very important. Right? So it is great that if you can solve a problem that has been common but difficult to solve. But it's also very important if you can set up a question nobody has asked before. Right? And then that's a good opportunity to make a big progress. So for example, many people are working on what is this gene doing or what is this molecule doing. But the question I posed when I started work on serotonin is how the brain controls the parameters for learning. That is a relatively rare question that have been asked. So from such a question, we could come to a hypothesis that serotonin may be controlling how long into the future you will take into account, like a temporal discounting. So that led to a very original work. Yeah, so asking an interesting question that has not been asked before is something I would recommend young researchers to do. Yeah.
Well, Professor Doya,
yeah.
Thank you ever so much for agreeing to be interviewed. Your comments are extremely insightful, and I wish you well in your continued research. So thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity.